program, and many others. So very pertinent for us. And I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Clea McNeely, who is on faculty at the University of Tennessee. She got her public health training at the UCLA School of Public Health and has been on faculty at the University of Minnesota School of Medicine and the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and has been here at UT for, I don't know how long, for 3 years. She's widely published in the field of adolescent brain craziness. I'm sorry. Or at least it seemed crazy when I was there. So we're going to auction off one of her books here in a moment. So she's widely published, and she'll be presenting. Go ahead. What do you?
No, that's the wrong slide. The title of the talk is the same as the flyer.
Okay.
Go back one.
There we go. Here, she's going to present that. So without further ado, Dr. Irwin is going to do the raffle. Oh, you don't have to. I'm sorry. You have to stay if you want to. You have to be present to win. You have to stay. So, Dr. McNeely.
We're hard, aren't we? We have to stay here. Well, thank you so much for having me. I've been wanting to talk about this stuff in East Tennessee for a really long time. So I'm really, really thrilled with this opportunity. We chose the title of this talk as consciously as a marketing strategy. The adolescent brain and work still in progress. And maybe it was that, maybe it was the CEUs that we offered, whatever. A lot of you came and we're really grateful. If I had adolescents in the audience, this is what I would call this talk. Love school friendship, surprising facts about teen brains and bodies. Teens would be offended about being called a work in progress. Only with age, sorry, I didn't mean to let you only with age, looking at myself, do we recognize that we're all still works in progress. And this is just one tiny example of the vast difference in the way that teens and adults experience and interpret their worlds. And the point I want to talk about today is how if we as adults can understand that experience, we will live through it as teens, but if we can now understand it with our adult brains, how that can make teens so much more enjoyable and our work so much more effective as teens. Is the volume okay or is it a little loud? It's good. When I was at Johns Hopkins, I was with the Center for Adolescent Health, but I actually wrote this book at UT, so UT gets a lot of credit for this book. We put this message in a book called The Teen Years Explained. It was funded by the CDC. I don't get a penny, just so you know, I'm not doing self-promotion. Well, sort of. And it's free downloadable. I'll put the website up again at the end. So you can download it for free, and then we'll raffle it off. It's also on Amazon.com. So one of the things we started doing in the book is wanting to address some of the common myths that are out there about teens. So one myth is that teens think they're invincible. Everyone knows that if you smoke, you get lung cancer, including teens. And yet they think they're invincible. Right? And so they do it anyway. In truth, teens actually overestimate their personal vulnerability to lung cancer, getting in a car crash if they drink, getting HIV if they have unprotected sex. They feel very vulnerable. What they don't do is necessarily act on those perceptions of vulnerability, and that's in large part due to brain development, which we'll talk about. Another common misperception is that teens only listen to their friends. How many of you have driven teens in your car and they're busy in the back texting to each other so they can't hear you? And if there's any other feeling of being irrelevant, I can't think of one that makes you feel more relevant as an adult. But in truth, again, adults matter. In fact, we matter more than other teens. We are the most important people in teens' lives. And I have never found a single study in which teens have said, who is the biggest influence in your life, or who matters most in your life, or who has shaped you the most, where they have pointed to peers rather than adults. They always point to the adults in their lives. So we have to ignore all those social cues of being tuned out and remember that we matter, because they're not going to give us the warm fuzzies anymore to let us know. And finally, low self-esteem leads to risky behavior. We have been doing programming on this correlation for years. And in fact, it's just a correlation. It's a spurious association. We now know that some kids who have high self-esteem have more confidence, which leads them to engage in more risky behavior. So these are just a few of the myths that we tried to tackle. These are two girls from Baltimore in a program I worked in, and I just love some of these photos. So these are some of the themes in the book. The first is positive youth development. And this is Karen Pittman's bumper sticker phrase, that adolescents are resources to be developed, not problems to be solved. The idea that adolescence is a tremendous time of opportunity. No time other than infancy is there as much development as there is during adolescence. During adolescence, teens gain 50% of their adult body size. This is what's going on. I didn't realize this was on, so I'm going back. No, it's okay. I just wondered why it was a little disconcerting. Hopefully this is better for you. 50% of their adult body weight during adolescence. They become capable of reproducing. And there's phenomenal changes in the teen brain that are every bit as big as what's happening during infancy. So, what is going on in the teen brain? We can observe, well, I'll get to that in a minute. That's the other theme of the book, is what's going on in the teen brain. Another theme is that adults and settings matter a lot. Development doesn't happen in a vacuum. And in fact, some of the things that happen developmentally even help, we're beginning to think they even help shape the structure of the brain. And finally, out of sync is completely normal. There's all these different trajectories of development. There's cognitive development, there's spiritual development, there's physical development, which we're probably the most familiar with, and there's social and emotional development. And these don't happen in sync or on track. And so one example is, I'm a big sister with big brothers, big sisters, and my little sister has just tremendous social and emotional development. Every time I pick her up, she gets in the car, she names the emotion she's feeling, she tells me why she's feeling it, and she tells me what she's done to cope. And then, she's forgotten her homework for the 16th time in a row. She opens her bag, it's a hurricane. So she has this tremendous emotional development, and her executive function is just not there yet. And that is completely normal. But it can be a little bit disconcerting as an adult working with teens. So today, the idea is to describe brain development, discuss implications for teens, especially around social and emotional development, and provide ideas throughout for what we as adults can do. Here's another picture of my Baltimore kids reading a chick book, The Life of Bees. I don't know if this is posed or not. They just look way too interested in that book. This is like a mom's fantasy of her adolescent child. Brain development early in life. This shows the development of what we call gray matter, which is the neurons and synapses over the first 2 years of life. And what you see is we start with very few, and they just grow exponentially. Oops. We used to think that this was the major period of brain growth. And in fact, how many of you remember Bob Reiner and his real huge policy advocate? And he said in this speech, by age 10, your brain is cooked and there's nothing much you can do. And through his work and his advocacy, partly due to that, there's been a tremendous disinvestment in the adolescent years. Both the psychological and emotional disinvestment, they've reached middle school, it's too late, and also a financial disinvestment in the teen years, moving it towards the early years, which I'm not wanting to pit one against the other. The point I'm wanting to make is that it's both. Because starting in the 1990s, the National Institutes of Health, Jake Eade at NIMH, started taking MRI scans starting in infancy every 2 years. And by 2005, they had over 4,000 scans on several thousand individuals. And they found there's two waves of brain development. There's the brain development in infancy, which I just showed you. And then there's another spurt where the gray matter of the brain takes off, another huge spurt of growth before puberty kicks in. And after that huge spurt of gray matter, which is the thinking part of the brain, then comes the development of white matter. So the gray matter gets pruned, and then white matter is this myelination around the nerves that is basically reduces friction. And so things move much more efficiently. It's like increasing your bandwidth. And the way the gray matter gets pruned is a use it or lose it. The things you do a lot, those pathways become very efficient. The things you don't use, it becomes harder to gain those skills. Think of language development. Think of people my age trying to text rapidly. Things that we did not do during childhood and adolescence get pruned, and it's harder to develop them later. Not impossible, but harder. And this image just shows, visually shows how brain development works. On the left side, just to orient you, on the left side is age 5, the line, and on the right side is age 20. I don't know why they have kids going downhill with age, but that's how they set this up. And the blue shows basically greater maturity, greater brain development, higher functioning. And the point I want to make with this slide is that it moves from the back to the front. The back of the brain, the limbic area, is where the emotional center is. Emotional experiencing of emotions. I'm really simplifying this. So those of you who know more, bear with me. And then in the front, of course, we know about the prefrontal cortex, which is the executive function, the reason, the impulse control. So you get more development of the emotional areas of the brain before you get capacity to control impulses. Is this starting to make adolescents feel a little more understandable? Just that fact. And brain development affects every aspect of adolescent development. And we decided, in talking about what we wanted to talk about today, we decided to focus on social and emotional development because it's one of the least talked about areas in terms of the role of brain development. Social and emotional development is necessary for us to have successful intimate friendships, successful marriages, successful relations with our colleagues, professional relationships in the community. Emotional competence is the ability to perceive, assess, and manage one's own emotions. Social competence, in contrast, is the capacity to be sensitive and effective in relating to other people. So emotional competence is what do I feel? It's learning to recognize and name emotions. So when you see a kid and they say, how do you feel? And they say, bad, right? Or lousy, or I don't know. That's a very typical adolescent response to describing, and accurate, to describing their feelings. And what we can do as adults is help them begin to name it and to identify the cause. What's making you feel lousy? Are you anxious? Are you sad? Are you happy? Are you frustrated? Giving them a vocabulary that they can then learn to use to describe their feelings, and then figure out, well, what is making you feel sad? What is making you feel anxious? And once you have that figured out, sometimes that awareness is enough to allow the emotion to have less grip on you. This is true for everybody. And sometimes that awareness is the first step in saying, okay, I'm anxious about the test. What can I do about it? Social competence is about recognizing what other people feel. And it's a key to developing empathy. So recognizing emotions in myself, and also recognizing emotions in other people. Adolescents have a really hard time with social competence. And it's because their brain is not very accurate at recognizing what emotions other people have. Sometimes they're not good at recognizing that other people have emotions, even though they do. and sometimes they're not good at recognizing what those emotions are, which is why you see this tremendous paradox of young people being highly sensitive to insults, and yet then turning around and doing something quite cruel, breaking up over a text, calling a friend a name, telling a friend you don't want to be friends anymore, all of the drama of the adolescent years. And it's this whole social competence piece. Their emotional parts of the brain are firing really well. They're experiencing all these emotions. They're getting satisfaction out of experiencing all these emotions. But their social competence is just not there yet. And this really interesting study was, a series of studies was done. What emotion do you see in that guy's face? Fear, surprise. Well, this is supposed to be fear. I Googled fear photos, and I got this. Someone graded this as being fearful. But Deborah Yergin-Todd, she's now at the University of Utah, and her colleagues did this really interesting series of studies where they showed teens these kind of exaggerated expressions of fear, anger, surprise. And the adults, for the most part, correctly identified the emotion they were viewing. The teens did not. The teens looked at a photo like this and said shock, anger, but less likely to say fear. I mean, not completely out of the ballpark, right? They wouldn't look at that and say happy. But they weren't quite getting the cue right. And so until that prefrontal, so then they repeated the experiment with functional MRIs. So when the adults looked at this, both, again, the emotional center of the brain and the prefrontal cortex areas involved in identifying emotions lit up on the functional MRI. For the teens, the prefrontal cortex, there wasn't much activity. They were interpreting emotions almost completely through the emotional center of their brain. So they just didn't have that judgment. It was the judgment they were lacking about what this expression is. So how can we help? One of the easiest ways is to tell teens exactly what we're feeling. And with my little sister, I'm like, I'm really crabby because I'm hungry. I'm not mad at you. And now it's gotten annoying because she's so dang emotionally confident. She says, are you hungry? Every time. Like, no, I'm serious this time. I need you to listen to me. I'm being firm. But then I have to say, this is what I am. Right? I am being firm. I need you to hear me. I am upset about something. And you can do that as a parent. You can do that as a clinician. You can do that as a teacher. I'm having a bad day, kids. I'm saying we can do this as, I'm unfortunate not to be a clinician as a teacher or a teacher, but we can do this as teachers or clinicians and say, I'm having a really busy day. If I'm distracted, it's because I have a lot on my mind, and it's not about you. And it may feel kind of weird to do in a professional situation because we would not necessarily do it with an adult. But kids really benefit. And then also help teens describe how they're feeling with others. So if a teen is upset, how do they communicate that in a better way than saying, I don't want to be your friend anymore? Let's talk about peers. Brain development affects the importance of peers in teens' lives and why teens behave differently from peers. Once teens hit puberty, or children hit puberty, teens assume a much more prominent role in their life in the sense that they really matter. And their orientation about what's important is much more skewed towards their peers. And probably you notice that teens behave differently when they're with their peers than they do when they're alone and when they're with their family. And again, we tend to attribute that to peer influence. And it is due to peer influence, but it's also due to brain development, the way teens respond to their peers. So another really interesting series of studies was done in part by Larry Steinberg at Cambridge University. And they had 3 groups. They had teenagers, they had college students, and they had adults. And they put them inside a video driving bay. And they measured how much risk they took. So which group do you think did the most risky driving? It was all the same, actually. They all took the same amount of risks. Then they brought in their peers. So the teens were with teens, the college students with college students, etc. And everything changed. The adults did not increase the riskiness of their driving. The college students increased the riskiness of their driving by 50%, and the teens increased the riskiness of their driving by 200%. Okay? Twice as much risk with the peers present. And they then repeated it with functional MRI, and again saw that when the teens were driving by themselves, the judgment area of their brain lit up and the emotional center lit up. When they were driving with their peers, pretty much only the emotional center lit up. It tended to override judgment, which is not as well developed. So what does this tell us? This and a lot of other studies, we know that the experience of social acceptance is more rewarding for teens than for adults. It is rewarding in the way that, cheesecake is rewarded, literally rewarding, right? And that taking risks is more rewarding for teens than adults. So they've done these kind of similar experiments with gambling, and gambling with peers. So that's risk-taking and risk-taking with peers, and they get similar results. So you put the two together, risk-taking with peers is particularly rewarding for teens. And that's why teens will take risks even when they understand or overestimate the negative consequences. The experience of enjoyment and reward is so much greater for them than it is for adults. Okay. Macho behavior and social status. I want to talk a little bit about gender differences here. Both boys and girls are very afraid of public humiliation. It's the opposite of social acceptance. It's painful, very painful. However, boys in our society have a much narrower range of behaviors that are socially acceptable. And these tend to be the macho kind of boy, they're called the boy code by people who write about this. The boy code. And so they're more likely to engage in nasty norms in front of their friends. Even when the kids don't, not everyone loves the thrill of a risk, right? I don't want to paint all kids equal. But even when they don't love this, given this context of needing to follow the boy code, they will engage in more risky behavior. Dating. Dating is good and bad, positives and negatives. Lots of positives. It leads to emotional growth. Through dating, teens experience happiness, excitement, disappointment, and despair. And they learn how to cope with all those emotions. And both boys and girls value emotional intimacy. Boys want intimate friendships. Boys want intimacy, and I mean emotional intimacy, not sexual intimacy. Boys also want emotional intimacy in their relationships. That's one of the myths I should have put up at the top. Let's talk about some of the downsides of dating. This is a quote from Liz Miller, a colleague of mine, she's at UC Davis, who did a study, and she concluded saying most teens don't understand what a healthy relationship is, often mistaking the controlling behaviors that characterize abuse for signs of love. She did it's not a huge study, but she did a study of a few middle schools in California, and 100% of the respondents, 100% said that possessiveness and jealousy are part of true love. So teens are very susceptible to being in controlling and abusive relationships. Teens of both gender are susceptible to being victimized in this way. And where might those messages be coming from? I don't need to say anymore. I've seen every one of these videos. So what can we do? We can model healthy friendships and romantic relationships. Explain what healthy relationships look like. What are the signs of unhealthy relationships? and help teens, again, always identify their own emotions. How does that make you feel? Does that, when he or she does that make you feel loved? Does that make you feel that? And helping them name the emotions that they're feeling. Acknowledging that sometimes the controlling behavior makes them feel special. You have to acknowledge why it's attractive as well. This is a really tall order for us. We're still struggling ourselves, many of us, to manage our own emotions and resolve conflicts in mature ways. So, to conclude, development happens in context, and I want to reemphasize again the importance that we all matter, all of us as adults. And Kathleen Call at the University of Minnesota calls these arenas of comfort. And the more arenas where positive developmental supports can be in place, the better it is for children. If we are teachers, social workers, coaches, bus drivers, neighbors, parents, every arena matters. And what's really interesting is the effects all seem additive. Meaning, even if a young people has some fairly good supports in his or her life, when we can add to that. It's all additive. And what are some of the implications for policies and programming? And I'll just throw a few out that then can lead to a discussion. One thing I think about a lot is that some health behavior models may not apply to teens. We use several health behavior models that people understand the risks that something poses, and people understand that they are vulnerable to that risk. They don't do whatever the behavior is that causes poor health. Teen brain development, what we're starting to learn, suggests that model may not be adequate for teens. We may need to expand them and think about it slightly differently. Those models also suggest that focusing on risk is not adequate. So just getting people to realize risks and focusing on them isn't going to get us where we want to go. And there's a lot of program evaluations showing that over and over and over again, that risk reduction programs have limited success. And so fostering positive development is important. And then the other thing is, we have to remember we want teens to take risks, right? We want them just to enter friendships and intimate relationships, which is really risky for the first time. We want them to get a job. We want them to eventually leave home. We want them to go in the military. We want them to start to drive. Well, and we do and we don't. That's a love-hate thing, right? But we need them, and they need to be risk takers. So how do we make the context such that when teens take risks and make mistakes, because they will make mistakes, that the consequences are not so devastating? And so there's all kinds of policies that are starting. Some are, for example, limits on driving with peers in the car. Minnesota's doing that. Safe places for hanging out with friends, experimentation, and risk-taking. And there's a lot taking this framework and applying it, I think, to bullying, which is something that we're all being asked to pay a lot of attention to for good reason. About 30% of teens are bullied, or bully themselves. It's more common among younger teens who are more socially insecure. And people who are bullied are those who don't comply with gender norms or low social status. And here I want to just use an anecdote. And again, I'll go back to my little sister, who would be mortified probably if she knew how much I was talking about her. I invited her today, but she didn't get permission. But say what you will about No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind allowed me to help her transfer schools. So she was in a school where she was chronically sexually harassed. And she was not supported by the leadership of that school. They did not believe her when she made complaints. And so she began defending herself. She became a fighter. And she started hitting first. If there was even a threat of some kind of bullying, a whiff, she would beat someone up. It was a train wreck waiting to happen. She was headed toward expulsion in 6th grade. We were able to get her transferred to another school. And this school has a climate where bullying is handled. Bullying is not tolerated, and it's the adults who are in charge, and it's the adults who handle it. The kids are not left alone to handle it. So she's believed when she reports cases of sexual harassment, and it's stopped. The fighting has stopped. The fighting continued on the bus, however, to and from the old neighborhood, right? But, given the more limited scope of the problem, I was then able to say, work with some of the emotional development tools and tell her it was unacceptable for her to be fighting me. She had to find another way. And she hasn't been in a fight since last April. And that's an example of the context that adults create, giving kids the safety and the space to make mistakes, to bully, but the consequences aren't dire. You learn not to do it again. To be bullied, the consequences aren't dire. You get help, you learn that there's help there. And so these experiences become growth experiences rather than destructive experience. And that's our job as adults. I'm slightly passionate about this case. So, in conclusion, I want to end with a caution that the brain science doesn't give us reason to discount young people or to discount adult influence. Also, have humility about what we know about the brain. Remember what Rod Reiner said about 15 years ago, that we had brain development all figured out. There's probably so much more for us to learn that we don't understand yet. And I've said it enough times, I think creating supportive environments in as many arenas as we can is how we can really help our young people be healthy. So thank you very much. And we have 15 minutes, it's 1:45. Have a discussion? Yeah.
Going back to your discussion about social competence, and has there been a lot of research done on what we can do as adults to get them in a better place when it comes to social competence? What are some actual things that as adults we can coach them to make that an easier transition?
We actually have a panel, right, to help answer some of these questions. Is that something you want me to tackle, or
Sure,
you want to?
you can tackle that. You
Just like,
tackle that one very well, I think.
okay. Well, I think it's in some ways, I tend to talk about principles, and then the specific actions will vary from relationship to relationship and person to person. So the principles are demonstrating high levels of caring, high support for autonomy, and good structure or behavioral regulation. So when we can provide those three, we sometimes call them the big three, when we can provide those three, kids will, then within that we can develop social competence. So again, I'll go back to my little sister about the fighting. We were up on the UT campus and we were in a fight, and I said that's not acceptable, and I was trying to get her to cognitively process why it was not a good idea to hit somebody, and it wasn't going anywhere. This was getting this back at me. And so I finally said, you know what? I'm really disappointed in you. You can do better. You can figure out a way not to make this happen. And that was what I needed to do. So the actual content of the communication, we have to experiment. We have to figure out what's going to work for which child. But these principles of saying, I expect high expectations, you have autonomy, so I'm adding a fourth. High expectations, you have autonomy to do experimentation. I will create a safe environment for you to do that. Structure around that environment, behavioral regulation. If you behave in certain ways, there's consequences. So, and caring, always caring. That no matter what happens, there's caring there.
I'm really fascinated by the research that you described in looking at adolescent adults and risky behaviors by themselves and then without peers. So if you take one teen and do the driving test, no excess risk. You take another teen, do the driving test, no excess risk. You put them together, there's tremendous amount of excess risk apparently. Do they recognize it at the time or after the fact? I will say at the time they apparently don't recognize it, but after the fact, do they recognize it?
I don't know. And if they do recognize that they're taking more risk, they actually may be consciously choosing to take more risk because it's thrilling. And avoiding the negative consequences of taking that risk. Taking the risk and having it come out okay, it's really thrilling. So I don't know, I can't point to a paper that studied that, but they very well may be aware of it. Which is why these models of theory of reasoned action and health belief models are limited when applied to adolescents.
Fascinating.
Anita.
I really liked what you said about, adults being in charge of being sure that there is a safe environment as opposed to bullying. There's a lot of programs out there, from a very young age where children are taught how to recognize bullying, what to do if they see bullying. And I've seen it in my own children where they're really on board with that when they're children, and as they enter middle school, they come home with stories but don't step up to that. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about how we can help some of our institutions understand that, because I think there's also a lot of times, if you aren't in that situation, you often can have people who think, oh, children just go through this, or it's not a big deal, or kids will be kids, and not realize that it can be very harmful, especially in light of the fact that we've had 2 recent youth suicides because of being bullied because of sexual orientation or perceived sexual orientation. So do you have anything you want to add to that, how we can help our institutions to recognize that?
Well, I think I have a lot to say about that actually. We have really moved in the direction of this, really embracing, especially in our culture, this autonomy for youth empowerment. And that's really good, and it's really important. But again, it's often done with the understanding of the adult brain and not the young person's brain. So when we empower youth, we empower them to become peer leaders. And we want our young people to change the social norms in an environment. So we create peer leaders and we teach them, how do you intervene when you see bullying? How do you intervene when you see someone being in a fight? And that may be, especially for younger students, middle school students, that may be demanding more than their peers. And so I think that we really need to, we think about these peer norms, and we forget that we as adults create the context in which those peer norms develop. We don't create the peer norms. We would never choose a culture of bullying. But what system have we created that allows a culture of bullying? And how have other systems helped produce that? Because chronic bullying is not inevitable. And so I think that really having the most powerful actors in whatever the setting is, if it's an after-school program, having the leadership of that program, if it's a school, having the school leadership, if it's our playground, whatever the setting is, having the leadership be very clear in communicating the role of adults. And it's really hard, because it isn't always easy. What do you do? So you see bullying, you go through all the first 5 attempts to fix it, and you have a chronic bullier. And the parents are chronic bulliers. And the parents start bullying you about their child who's a bullier. So I'm not saying this is easy. But what I do know is that we can't leave it up to the kids. Was that helpful? I'm very leery of peer-led anti-bullying programs. They work great out in the community, but once they're placed within a norm that is supportive of chronic bullying, it's tough to get a lot of traction in those programs. In 4 minutes. Oh, no, 2 minutes, because we have a wrap. Thank you very much.
You're saying you were against the peer-led anti-bullying. What are your thoughts on peer-led pregnancy prevention?
Well, I think peer-led programs are fabulous. I think they're really fabulous for the peer leaders. I'm not against the programs. I think we expect too much of them. I think they're fabulous programs. But I think we expecting peer-led programs to change social norms in a setting. I don't think we're sophisticated enough. We don't have enough understanding yet. I do a lot of research in peer networks and friendship networks, and they're doing some really neat experiments where they group friendships together, and then they'll deliver, so Tom Valenti out of USC is doing this work where it's I think it's a smoking prevention program. And so they identify the natural peer groups, and they group them together. And they deliver the intervention, which involves a lot of collaborative work in the natural peer groups. And then they have a comparison condition where they just randomly group kids. In the natural peer groups, the programs are more effective, except in the groups where they're about to start smoking anyway, or they're already smoking, and then they do harm. They reinforce negative behaviors. Okay? So we're really flirting with a lot of iatrogenic effects, a lot of unintended negative consequences when we start grouping peers together and trying to do interventions with peers. We just don't, I think it's super powerful, but we don't quite know how it's powerful. So I'm not against them, I think we just don't understand them. And sometimes they work, and sometimes they don't, and sometimes they do harm, and we just don't know enough yet. But we have to start somewhere. We have to be doing something. Thank you.